Hello, friends. Patrick McFarland here of the Liberty Weekly podcast, coming at you with another episode. This one is episode 186, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/186. And on the line, I have Scott Spaulding, our Marine friend and host of the Why I Am Anti-War podcast. And you're involved in a whole bunch of other stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, nothing too exciting, just like state libertarian politics and whatnot, and defend the guard and trying to push defend the guard. Those are the two big things I'm working on.
Well, you've testified in like, was it state Congress committees?
I was just trying. Yeah, they asked me to testify. I think when they were testifying in North Dakota or Montana. I'm sorry, North Dakotans and Montanans. If you're listening, I mixed them up. So,
basically the same thing, right?
I imagine it's not, or very passionate differences exist that I'm not aware of.
All right. Well, so to do
but
this,
likewise for Michigan, and Wisconsin in my head too. Just East Coast elitists not able to tell the difference.
Yeah. It's all flyover country, is what it is. Well, we've been talking for a little bit here, but we're gonna do part 2, which will be covering Scott's second deployment, and this is your second deployment was again to Iraq. And I'm just going to do a screen share here so you can see, everyone can see. This is the first episode that we did was episode 177, talking about the second battle of Fallujah, where Scott was deployed and his experience during that deployment. So we're going to pick up where we left off, but that one is, again, show notes at libertyweekly.net/177. So we actually, Scott and I got to meet in person at the Ron Paul conference a few weeks ago. That was pretty cool.
It was awesome. It was like really, like, I highly recommend participating in some kind of meet space, libertarian politics. Like, I do a lot of it on the internet, more than I should. Like, my balance is wrong. I'm doing more on the internet than in the real world, but it's really good to meet the people that you're talking to and to know that you're not the only crazy person around. And to feel like you're just to live in a normal world with normal people and not the rest of the rest of the world that doesn't see things the same way.
Well, it is really eerie because I've had this experience when I met people in real life before that it really does feel like you've known each other for, like, it's no different, really.
Yeah.
It's cool.
Well, it's just, I think I forget who I was listening to, but in general, when you do have a podcast audience, even if it's really small, 50 people, if they're listening to you an hour a day, that's more than you probably talk to most other people in your life. And certainly that's more people than you talk to for an hour, So just that amount of time with somebody in their head, and even if they don't talk, like, there's some people that I really do wonder what their actual life is like, but then there's a lot of people that are really candid about, well, I've got this going on, or I'm getting married this month, or we just had a kid and so I'm taking a break. Some people play it a little closer, but like when people are a little bit more open, or even just they mention offhand, well, I have to take a week off to go visit family or something, you get an idea about who they are and you start to really feel like you know them.
Yeah.
So
and it's strange because it's usually one way. Like, I feel like I know Dave Smith really well, but I've never met the guy.
Yeah, that's true.
So yeah, it's real funny. But so I think where we left off was that we had discussed, because at the end of our last episode we had discussed kind of when you got back a little bit and readjusting to civilian life. Then we talked about the morality of killing in war for a little bit. But just to, I guess, kind of recap that, and I know we wanted to touch on being back home and then going to your next deployment. So where do you think we left off?
Yeah, so I checked in a little bit. I rewatched a little bit too, and we were talking. We sort of got into a discussion about rape and looting in war, and how we didn't see much in the way of rape, or any for that matter, but like looting after war. We talked a little bit about how that just, well, it doesn't seem to be that anyone's owned this. Like a place where a battle has just happened can look pretty well abandoned. it's really not, it's not abandoned property, but to the person, to the Marine who wants some cigarettes, seeing a cigarette shop that the door has been kicked in, it looks like a perfectly inviting place to go stock up on cigarettes for free. You know what I mean? They're going to go stale anyways, or whatever they'll tell themselves, you know? So we were talking about that, and then a little bit about sort of, and you know, propaganda I think played a role in this, but like I got home and expected that, you know, I'd been through some things. I had been shot at and shot back. I'd gotten a Purple Heart, and I, on some level, really did feel like when we got home there would be this like everyone would know, or that that everyone would just, every woman would swoon at my feet. You know what I mean? Like that it's what they feed you in all the movies. You know what I mean? At the end of either before the big battle scene or right after, there's a big kiss. You know what I mean? Kind of thing. You know, and I didn't really find that to be the case. Most people, we got back to um, DC, where our unit was based out of, and for a month we just kind of showed up to work, and we had to go through classes about this, that, and the other. They weren't as really robust, but it was basically essentially clean up your rifles, and classes about, like, I don't know if it's really hard to remember whether they had the suicide awareness classes as much, but there was some thought given to reintegration, even then a year in, you know what I mean? That there has to be a little bit of decompression time that was mandatory. You had to go, you got like a few days of leave. You couldn't just go on vacation right away. And then you got like a weekend off, and then you had to come in and have some decompression time. And some people really resented that and just like, I want to get off orders and I want to go back to normal life right away. You know, I have a job to get back to or whatever. And some people like me just kind of were like, well, I'm getting paid and this is easy, so I'll keep collecting the paycheck. One thing that did kind of screw me, so I had coordinated with a friend of mine to rent an apartment where I was going to go to where I was going to undergrad, and that maybe we started our lease at the end of the school year around June. So I started going up every weekend. They had us working 4-day weeks, which was nice. So I would go up on like a Thursday and basically party all weekend at my college. And but one of the things that screwed me actually was I didn't really understand how leave worked with the military and the reserves. You can't save leave, or at least they led me to believe I could. So, you know, the GI Bill is hinged on the number of years, and there's like certain cutoff points. Like if you've done less than a year, you get a really minimal percentage of your GI Bill payments. And then if you've done more for a year to 1 year, and then a year to 3 years is when you're fully vested, right? So if you start collecting your GI Bill when you've only had less, if you use any of your GI Bill when you've had less than a year of active duty time, you're wasting, you're getting a prorated minimum benefit, but they count months. So if I use a month, whether I'm only getting paid out 10%, if I use a month of GI Bill at 10%, that month is gone. I never get it back. And that plays into my just frustration with military administration has always been terrible. And one of the things they did was they said, oh, well, I was like, well, I'm going to end my orders a month early because I had a year of orders. It would have been a full year of active duty time. I'll end it a month early and keep 30 days of leave because I know I'm deploying again, and maybe I'll want to take 60 days of leave because some people had wanted to get off on leave right away. I'll save that leave for next time. And then they say, yeah, sure, that's fine. Well, a few months later, I get this check because they sold my leave because reservists aren't allowed to save leave. And I only have 11 months of active duty. So as far as GI Bill payments go, I'm getting shorted now for the whole year instead of, so like, so that was just a little a tiny kick in the teeth, and a chronic problem in the military is they're always going to, like, they're always going to screw you over somehow with pay, and it's never their fault. They easily could have told me that you can't keep leave and we're going to sell it. And so you have to take the leave or lose it, you know, or you can actually stay on for the whole year and then sell your leave at the end, and you'll have 30 days of extra pay at the end and have a whole year of active duty time. Anyways, all that's to say that, like, the administration screwed me over at more than once. And that's fairly typical. But I get home, I'm basically just living in Towson, partying. I don't know if I even took summer classes, and I'm kind of just trying to live it up because I know that I'm going to be deploying again in the following June. So I didn't really apply myself very much. I passed most of my classes and dropped the ones that I was failing in time or whatever the case might have been, but it was not the highest priority for me. Actually, that I think I don't know if I mentioned this to you. I'll have to. I know I have. The Towson newspaper did a little highlight on me that I was, in between deployments and whatnot, and or as I was getting ready to go to my second deployment, they did a little piece on me right before as I was leaving for my deployment, and the person who interviewed me of all people was Brian Stelter.
Really? No kidding.
Yeah. He was. I have a byline written about me by Brian Stelter. I don't think he.
If it's still available, like, is it?
Yeah, it is. Well, I think you have to go. I have to dig into the archives, but I have a screenshot of it, relatively handy.
Well, while you're looking for that,
Yeah.
I started, and sorry, I've been trying to find out the title of the book, but I just started reading a book talking specifically about how media and movies and film influence like soldiers to sign up for war and how it influences their perception of combat. And it's super interesting. I wish I had it handy, but I'm trying to find it.
Yeah, let me see here. This is. Hold on. Yeah, so here we go. Should be. Of course, loading. Wait till it loads up. So in any case, while I was there, I kind of had it in my head that I nearly got killed once, and so there wasn't any reason to really worry about those types of things. You have a good. Yeah, so there's my byline by Brian Stelter.
Very cool.
Fulfilling his duty to America. Enrolling in Arabic. Huh?
How did that make you feel?
At the time, I don't know. It was. I felt like, so at the time, it was printed like in the fall as I was already in Afghanistan, in Iraq. So they interviewed me like right at the beginning of the fall semester that I had withdrawn from to go deploy. And I think, if anything, I was 22 at the time, and I had made a lot of college friends, people you think you're really close to, and that's not to say that they weren't good, real relationships, but I did feel like I was like, I spent basically all of my money that I, 20 something $1,000 in the course of that year, mostly buying people beer. You know what I mean? So I had a lot of friends, let's say, or people who, and so I did feel like having a newspaper on being on the cover of the school newspaper the day that I was like leaving for Iraq. I don't know. It did make me feel good. You know what I mean? On some sense that like the people that I knew might see that and remember me. I was very concerned about like, even at that time, I was very concerned about if I did coming back to like having like all the friends that I worked at a bar as a doorman during that time, and having, knowing that when I came home that there would be a bunch of people waiting for me with a beer, you know what I mean? Like, this just felt like a good reminder to, that I was out there doing this. I don't know. I think at the time I didn't feel great about like the title fulfilling a duty to America, but I did feel like it was good to, and also, one of the things that did happen, and I mentioned, and I'm seeing it in the article here, he phrases a flashback that wouldn't be exactly accurate, but I was taking in the fall, I took an Arabic class. In between deployments, I took a class in Arabic. I thought I might fill my language requirement taking Arabic, and well, to be fair, the professor wasn't great and all that, but also, and maybe I was playing it up, but there was a kid, I don't know where he was from, but he looked very eerily like somebody who, a dead body I had seen. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it would be distracting. Like that he looked very much like, because on my first deployment, we did this body detail where we're cleaning up bodies from the Battle of Fallujah. So then to like have this guy, it did kind of mess with my head a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
To just like sometimes I would just catch myself just staring at this dude. And you know what I mean? And like, yeah, like looking back, I really did feel like I was like looking at someone who was dead. It was very eerie. And I had other little things that I don't know if I mentioned in that little article, but like, I do remember I was not comfortable driving when I came home from my first deployment for a while because I had been the driver for one of our Humvees. And even though we never had an like I was on one convoy where like a vehicle way ahead of us hit a small IED. No one was killed. But it could have easily happened, So we were always like chronically vigilant for like any piles of garbage on the side of the road kind of stuff. And there was at least one incident when I did start I didn't drive for at least 2 or 3 weeks. I had people drive me around. I didn't want to drive. And partially I was just tired of it. Partially I kind of just didn't feel like it. I wasn't accustomed to the amount of traffic and like I was, kind of unaccustomed to driving and I just needed to get my like gently. But when I did start driving again, there was one incident where like I did basically like instinctively saw something, felt like I saw something suspicious, like a garbage bag on the side of the road, and I cut across like 6 lanes of 695. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just to like get to the other side of the highway. I could have easily, I wouldn't even say that I looked at what cars were around or whatever. I just saw that and dove to the other side of the highway. You know, so, and that's something that was not covered in any of those classes coming home. But that was kind of my time at home was mainly sort of geared towards having fun, trying to like live it up, make friends, and then get ready for this upcoming deployment. Now, one of the things that is technically true is there's a policy called like dwell time. They could have forced us to deploy again, but as long as they felt like they had enough people, they weren't going to force me to deploy again. It was not obligatory. They actually found people from other units to augment. Some of my friends from my first deployment did not go on the second. My best friend and some of my other friends did. Most of us did, but some just were like, I'm doing one deployment. That was enough for me. I'm not going again if I don't have to. And so they let it be optional. And I hid that from my family, that it was going to be optional. My parents were getting divorced at the time. They were getting divorced at the time. They were like in the process and it was being drawn out as long as possible. And I didn't want to be around for it, frankly. Part of it was like, I couldn't deal with my mother and whatnot. And so it was nice to have this kind of escape. Like the first deployment, it wasn't really an escape thing. It was just, this is what I'm obligated to do. The second deployment, it was an option and it was a way of escaping. You know what I mean? Like even though I was in my 20s and things weren't, and really I was like, family going through divorce is not easy on anyone, but like it wasn't going to kill, like it shouldn't have, like my mother was a mess, but like it was bad enough for me psychologically that I felt more comfortable going to Iraq than dealing with my mother.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Did you find at all that you became like addicted to the adrenaline? Some vets will talk about that experience. Or was it enough adrenaline for you to get addicted to it?
No, I've never been an adrenaline junkie myself. You know what I mean? So I could see, I think there are people that were, there was like some risk and danger, but we weren't like chronically in combat. Like we were, we got in a few fights, but we weren't like, that wasn't our day-to-day job. Um, so I didn't find that feeling. I believe that it is probably pretty common. We definitely were really amped after like the first combat we got in, you know what I mean? Um, but, and I would have been, but actually, no, like by my second deployment, so as we were getting ready for that deployment, my boss comes to me and he says that we shouldn't deploy. My team leader from my first deployment, he was a captain at the time. He comes up to me and my best friend Andy and says to us, like, he had his first meeting with the commanding officer, this guy named Colonel Mario Lepe. He was somebody in the New York Police Department, and as he checked, he was the new commander for the whole unit, and my boss basically in his first meeting with him, he had like a staff-wide meeting with all the officers, and my boss comes back from that meeting and is like, whatever you do, don't go anywhere with this man. And he's an idiot, effectively. And he was a real friggin' moron. And I wouldn't have, from having had my first deployment with a really smart, we didn't, every military, they always think the next level of chain of command's terrible. They might think the first level in their chain of command's terrible, or they might love them. You know what I mean? We loved our boss, so I kind of thought that nothing could be really that bad, and everyone complains about the colonel anyways, so like, how bad could it really be? You know, and my, and I wouldn't say anything he did was so terrible as though it would get people killed exactly, but he did not manage the unit well or like do things intelligently. So as we started spinning up for the deployment, they had to bring in extra people. They asked for, they actually mobilized a Marine reserve unit out of Colorado called a MAWS, and I still don't know what that acronym stands for, but they basically were air traffic controllers. But they brought them over and had them retrained with us just because they needed more people they were letting guys from our unit not redeploy or deploy again, and bringing in new people from all over. And a lot of them were, and so they got retrained. Some of them there was a big quality spread. A lot of them were good. A lot of them were not interested. But they also just reorganized the units and teams in such a way that like they didn't really thoughtfully distribute the people who had experience in the job. It was just some teams were made up. They kind of kept almost separated the people coming from Colorado into one unit and the people who were from DC into one unit, but we were deploying together. And so you had half the people with no experience and some people with 2 or 3 deployments experience already deploying kind of separately. And they didn't give any thought to sending people back to where they had been before. I mean, we'd only been there, we got home from there in March of 2005, and we were going back in June of 2000 or August of 2006. So only a year and 3 months separated. I could still remember and still had maps of every street in Fallujah and had I could have driven most of Fallujah blindfolded kind of thing. Most of the streets I knew, where it was, who lived there even, who the important people there were. Like I think I mentioned before, we knew who the contractors were, and our contractors had been killed. And I would have thought that there would be some thought given to sending people back to where they had been. No such thing happened. They just treated it as though this is a completely new thing. We're not going to use any lessons learned. I got assigned to our unit's operations shop, which is effectively like operations would be for the colonel, for the higher ups, making sure that they have good information flow, effectively what operations. They plan training. So I was the one responsible for just like making sure a range was signed out before we went shooting or something like that kind of stuff. Like, oh, I need to schedule a day where this range is empty kind of stuff. And then during the deployment, you're mainly like, if you imagine like a combat operations center where there's screens and information being fed to the commander, somewhere in that room there's a E9 Master Gunnery Sergeant who's the ops chief, that's his structure, that's his place. He's designed it to please the commander and get information moving to him. He set up the desks the way he wants them, and I was just one of his minions, effectively.
So you go from being civil affairs to doing this job. Like, is this a civil affairs job?
Yeah, every unit will have every unit's going to have an ops section, and it's going to be composed of people from that job field.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
So initially though, your job in your first deployment was to be like a liaison with the local.
Actually out in the field doing it. Yeah. And this time I was assigned initially more to being in the ops section, which I was not happy about because I wanted to be out in the field, and I don't like being near the flagpole and at the bases that have, where you're living in the lap of luxury and where people are worried about, whether you shave today or not, kind of stuff. And so being assigned to ops, I was not pleased about. And it did mean, but one of the things would be like training. So I thought, okay, well, I'm in ops. I'm going to take some time and I'm going to try to write what they call a standard operating procedure for vehicles. What should be, because on our first deployment, we inherited unarmored bucket Humvees with boilerplates on the side. And we went to the trouble of like, what should be in the vehicle? How many smoke grenades? What do you need for how many flares do you need? What color flares mean what? Like a red flare means that a red star cluster means you're in danger and need help now. And a green star, like these different things are standard kind of across the Marine Corps, but not every Marine knows them, like especially some Air Wing Marine coming over. So you want to have like even down to where should, they do try to standardize where will a first aid kit be found on the person. That way that when you come up upon somebody who's injured, it's going to be in the same place. Where would the first aid kit be in the truck, in your vehicle, if there's a more robust one? How much ammunition do you store in your truck? And things like that. So I took it upon myself to write this entire SOP. And it was more or less immediately thrown in the rubbish bin. Nobody, what do you know, kind of stuff. And that just was kind of chronic, was just like, not all of us, all of the NCOs, all the people who had deployed once before felt like anything we learned was immediately disregarded, and they did the opposite from that command.
So does that mean there was no SOP for those things?
No, they basically just did none. They were just, like, they didn't publish it or standardize it within the unit. They just didn't care that I dedicated the time to doing it. I was trying to go over the top, and it just was, no, we don't need this. Like, whatever.
It just seems like it would be common sense to do those things.
Yeah. But it just common sense went out the window. The command didn't get, they were obsessed with other things. I don't even know, I can't even recall what, but so we get, for example, when I do get to Iraq, so it's kind of fast forwarding a little bit, through the summer we're training for the deployment. We do training down at a different area in Virginia. Doesn't really matter what the place is called. It's kind of near, it's kind of between Richmond and Quantico. We train there. We spent a month or so, doing vehicle operations and patrolling and shoot and rifle ranges and stuff like that. And then I'm in the op shop one day in August, and we're 2 weeks away from deploying actually, when there's a girl, this girl in the op shop comes in, comes out of the room, she's crying, she is knocked up. She was supposed to be what they call the cargo rider, which is like all the junk, printers, any junk the op shop wanted to have when we got to Afghanistan, computers, printers, crap like that, had to be put in a pallet, put in a container, and couriered over to Iraq. And she was supposed to be the one to do this. You know what I mean? And it was supposed to all be there when we got there and start being set up. So basically, this is a Friday afternoon. She's supposed to be leaving tomorrow, and she comes in and tells them she's pregnant. And basically the master guns looks around the room, and the other two people in the op shop, the two other NCOs in the op shop, are looking at their shoes. You know what I mean? And he's like, Spaulding, pack your bags, you're leaving tomorrow. You know what I mean?
Jeez.
So I fly. I go down to Cherry Point, North Carolina. They put our pallets on the plane. I get on the plane, and it's a C-17, which is a nice way to fly actually, because it's big and open, and if it's not packed full of people, it's just this. It's as big as a football field inside practically. You get up, walk around. You're not crammed into a seat. You can lay down, and there's power outlets. That was unheard of on a charter plane. When they fly you overseas on a charter, they pack you in like sardines, and you have your rifle, and there's nowhere to move, and it's just 17 hours on an economy commercial flight.
Do you know if soldiers now have smartphones when they deploy? Like, can they watch Netflix on their phones?
I brought with me on that deployment, I didn't have any electronic devices. I had an iPod maybe, but on my first deployment. On my second, I brought some little personal, like a Zune actually, that had like a color screen that was about this big.
Those.
Yeah. With whatever I could download off of Kazaa, I think, or LimeWire, crammed onto it. But yeah, people do bring stuff like that for comfort. And so, and actually I think I brought my laptop too, actually. So I get there and I get dumped off in al-Assad, and the op shop has made no plans. I know that somewhere at that base there will be, so like I basically just get dumped off. They put my pallets off to the side of the runway where they have a bunch of other pallets of stuff, and I'm there by myself. And I don't have even so much as a contact number from the people we're replacing. And also I'm supposed to be in Fallujah. I need to get all this stuff to Fallujah, not al-Assad. And I'm basically left to my own to try to find. So I go down and I find the third civil affairs group, the people who are replacing. And I was like, I need your help putting in, like, moving the stuff from here to here. And it was a ludicrous catch-22 where they're like, well, we can't put in to move your cargo because you don't have a controlled, your unit doesn't have a movement number, and we can't move it on our number, or something, like just silly accounting things. And I'm sitting there like, look, I know my one job here, in spite of the fact that I have no support, is to get this stuff from here to there. And I basically I'm asking the helicopter people, the people who run, there's always helicopters coming in and out of the airport too. And they'll usually run like a circuit or whatever. And I'm like, can I get these on the helicopters on it? And they're like, well, you need to get a number from your unit. And like, my unit's in Washington, they're not here yet. They have to, and they're like, they have to arrange it for you. And I'm like, well, it's not arranged, but I have to get it there. Like, what can you do to help me? Nothing. Go away. You know what I mean? And eventually I basically just start hanging out by the gate of al-Assad, thumbing it. Like, if a convoy is getting ready to leave, I'm just sitting there like, I try to I ask them where they're going and if they'll take me with them with 3 pallets of stuff. And eventually I just found some female lieutenant logistics Marine who said, yes, we're headed to Camp Fallujah, you can come. I have a feeling none of that was kosher. You know what I mean? They're really pretty obsessive. Like, on my first deployment, like, accountability is a thing. Like, they want to know every person and their line number, their, like, what they'll call a kill number sometimes, basically the last 4 of your social usually, or whatever, who you belong to, like what unit you are and where you're going. You know what I mean? And I'm basically just sitting there like hitchhiking. And I hitchhiked, but by this time, my unit actually was just landing in Fallujah. They had flown in and caught helicopters to Fallujah as my convoy, which made like a few stops along the way. Like, I show up and they're like, where the hell were you? You were supposed to be here already. You know what I mean? I'm like, anyways, and I was really miffed because, like, I felt like I went over the top trying to get the stuff there, and they were like totally ungrateful. And then you were talking about, well, what kinds of stuff do they occupy themselves with before? I'm pretty much immediately tasked by the colonel through the master guns with creating the old unit had a board with like their unit emblem on it, and like who was the commanding officer and who was in the second in command and where they were from or whatever. And I'm not an artist, but they're like, well, the third CAG's gone. We need a fourth CAG board. So I had to make like a 4x6 hand painted board with our symbol on it. Was like what I spent probably a week trying to do, was like get a stencil made up, draw this thing out, and then hand paint it, because that was the most important thing for me to be doing. And for a little while I was doing crap like, I think I have a picture of it, but like go ahead.
This reminds me of like, you know, where you go to like, I don't know, I'm thinking of like a university, and you go into a university department and they have like a greeting board with all the staff on it with like a little blurb about, oh, where is our, you know, front desk person from, and where's the like a student affairs person from. It seems like one of those.
Yeah, more or less exactly. So what they have here, I don't know if am I displaying the image?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah. So this is me, like this is our little office space in Camp Fallujah, and we were just like building walls and walling things off, and there was this had been like, I think we talked about it before. This is on Camp Fallujah, and what Camp Fallujah had been before was a training. Saddam had taken in the Mujahideen Khalq, which is like this weird cult that hates Iran, and this has been their training camp. Is what Camp Fallujah originally, we called it the Mech for a while. And this is when, you know, we were taking these big open like warehouses and turning them into office spaces. And what you can see here is like the sergeant major's board, like his policies on mustaches and, you know, basically HR information pinned up on the wall. And I had to paint those boards red and stencil them beautifully. You know what I mean? And junk like that is what I was at first occupied doing. I'm handy vaguely, but I'm not like, I've never worked construction. And among the things that was really peeving the colonel while I was in the op shop was there was like some uneven concrete where like a wall had been knocked down, and there was like some concrete like that he kept tripping on. So I had to ask and beg around from the CBs and whoever else had tools and get a jackhammer to try to smooth out the floor for him. And of course, when I started doing that, I had to then, they were upset when I was trying to do it in the morning, and some of them were still working or watching movies in their offices before they had to work. And so then they were like, you need to do this. I had to come in between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. so I could jackhammer the floor and then put concrete patch down and smooth it out for the colonel. So I was pretty miserable, and that's how it was until about October, my first month or so, a little more, 2 months there. But then, and it was all just pretty tedious nonsense stuff. I had my best friend, what they called the South Camp of Fallujah. There was a sort of just, you know, a area further down on a different side of the base, let's say. There was an infantry battalion based, and he was the civil affairs. He was in Fallujah before, and now was in Fallujah again. So I would go down to the other camp when I could, and hang out with him. He was brewing his own beer at the time, which was fun. In a Mr. Beer kit, which is like, it was terrible beer, but we would hang out and do, you know, just chit chat and whatnot. And occasionally, like on 2 or 3 different occasions, I managed to talk his boss into letting me go on patrols with them. There was one occasion where, in the city, my only real venture into Fallujah again was, they did apparently a monthly payroll run. The bank wasn't secure enough. Iraq had a socialist system, or just a pension system, you know, for government employees, and it fell on civil affairs to make sure that the payroll got delivered to the bank, the government's payroll for pensioners, so that they could pay out. But obviously they couldn't keep so much. So one of the patrols into Fallujah, basically we did was like escorted by tanks and whatnot, a few flatbed pickup or Humvees, bucket trucks filled with bales of cash that we had to that we like drove down the main road in Fallujah, met with the person at the bank and then delivered this mountain of cash like bale by bale. So I was just running in and out of the building. Actually, that's the reason why I don't have that many pictures, is that I was running through the gate with this, probably 80, 90 pound bale of money and my flak jacket on me. I kind of like bumped into the corner of the gate and it crushed my camera.
Do you want to show these locations on the map?
Sure. Yeah, I can pull up the Google map real quick. So this was Camp Fallujah.
First flew into al-Assad.
Yeah, right? So first I flew into al-Assad. Al-Assad is somewhere off in the desert around here. I'm not certain I could actually pick it out of a map. I think it might be, this looks like it could be it. No, that's Al-Qaim. I don't honestly know where al-Assad is. It's out in the west, somewhere off of this, somewhere kind of south of these areas, because I know that we weren't far. It was interesting too, because it was kind of a strange, it was in this sort of depression. Let's see if we can just Google al-Assad real quick.
Yeah. Oh, that black box is up too.
Oh yeah, let me kill that. There you go. So there's al-Assad. It was pretty huge. It's just for context. It's kind of relatively west towards the desert below Haditha, and it's huge. I mean, there's several runways. The camp, the main drag of the camp was this area here. You can see they had a pool and a football stadium and kind of huge cafeterias, several of them. And then I was stuck somewhere on the sort of far side by where the runway was, just kind of waiting by the gate to see if I could catch a ride. I was like basically camping out in the parking lot for a week or so, trying to catch a ride. So that's al-Assad, and then drive a few hours down. I was pretty nervous that there were like 3 or 4 trucks blown up just the morning that I caught this ride. This what they called uranium or ASR uranium here was one of the most heavily IED'd roads. And I know it's astounding too, because it really wasn't, there's nothing there. There's no villages nearby. There was nothing around, but somehow people would manage to sneak out and lace this road with IEDs every evening. Even though it's relatively remote, every convoy that went out of there, it was a pretty strong chance of getting blown up on. And then drive down to Fallujah, and just west of Fallujah, or just east of Fallujah, is this area here. This is all Camp Fallujah here. And the south camp would be down kind of almost by this exit onto this highway. This area here was called South Camp, or a bunch of containerized like living housing units. And then the main camp, what we called the Mech, was all here, and it had been like I said, it had been some kind of training and headquarters place for the Mujahideen cult / militant group that was being trained to try to overthrow the Iranian regime by Saddam. And in here, like officers' quarters were around here. The colonel, the dope that was in charge, at various points, and I think this was the Chow Hall, and I lived, I think right around here was where my hooch was, a few miles down the road. The colonel who was in charge, he had to go to, obviously, like the MEF, the Marine Expeditionary Force Commander, the highest ranking Marine in charge of the entire Western Iraq area. Our colonel would have to brief him. And I don't know what he said or did that was so outrageously stupid, but he was never allowed to speak in one of the MEF staff meetings again after he spoke up about something. He was just unbelievably dumb, and he said something so stupid that he was allowed to come to every meeting, but his second in command had to answer all questions.
Wow.
Because he was incompetent and a funny story, he was accustomed to being, I was not his, thankfully did not get tasked with being his driver. There was a kid who was a real brown noser, who was his normal driver, who had to drive him. Mainly, the colonel never really left this small portion of the camp here that was like relatively luxurious, and most of the high-ranking officers never did either. They would live in these little bungalows, and then their office spaces were all in here. But he would have to go to a meeting, maybe practically, for all intents and purposes, across the street. It was, less than a block away. He would have to go to these meetings, and he would expect to be driven in a contract rented SUV with air conditioning to and from them, maybe a half mile. One day, whatever company like KBR that was providing them would have to do regular servicing on the vehicles, and it wasn't available. So they asked me to get a Humvee and pick him up, and he had never been in a Humvee before.
Wow.
Because he was looking around for the seatbelt. There really aren't seatbelts in Humvees, or they're not really ever used. They're just kind of tucked away. I had to get a flak jacket, and one of the policies the military has is you have to have a Kevlar. The Marine Corps, you have to have a Kevlar helmet. You have to have your helmet on and a flak jacket while you're in a Humvee, mainly so you don't bump your head on the ceiling or something. And just as a matter of course. So when he goes to get in the vehicle, when I pick him up, he looks at the flak jacket and Kevlar on the seat that I had gotten for him, and is like, "What is this? Why is this here?" And I'm like, "So you're supposed to wear it in the vehicle," but it was quite a thing. But as we get into October, they decide that there's going to be a what they call a MU, Marine Expeditionary Unit, that's coming into the theater. So what would happen typically is there would be like a regular rotation, but then typically the Marine Corps always has a battalion of Marines afloat going around the Pacific or the Mediterranean, kind of to be available for emergencies. When you hear of like Marines going to these different places around the world, is usually on what's called a MU, and they chose to send this MU, divert them to Western Iraq. So they're adding another battalion to this western area of operations out in the desert, basically, for a few months, and they needed to send civil affairs people to support them. And I was fortunate enough to get out of Camp Fallujah and be sent there. So we ended up driving a Humvee. We kind of hitched a ride with a convoy and drove I think we drove first actually to al-Assad, and then from al-Assad out to Camp Korean Village, which is more or less out just near where the main highway that goes through Western Iraq forks, and half of it goes to Syria and half goes to Jordan. And they were responsible for keeping the route secure and interdicting anything that might be being smuggled in from Syria or Jordan to a lot of supplies came in through Jordan by truck, and then a lot of they were supposed to interdict things that might be coming in through Jordan or through Syria, sorry. And they were based out of what was called Korean Village, which is right around just west of a little village called Rutba. And see if I can nail that down for us here. There it is. So here's Camp Korean Village. It was a small fob. At the time, all that was there was a light armored reconnaissance battalion, which is basically an infantry battalion, but with fewer infantrymen and these vehicles called LAVs. I'll show you a picture. that they would use to get around. You can fit a few people inside of the back, about maybe 6, maybe 8 people crammed into the back, and they have a turret with a 25 millimeter cannon, and all this front space is engine space. So there was an LAV battalion here, and they were going to be augmented by a MEU. Actually, they got one company of the MEU, which is about 250 Marines, and the rest of the MEU's support. And then 2 of the companies, the most dangerous spot or the most violent spot at the time was Ramadi, which is just west of Fallujah over here. So 2 of the companies of the MEU were sent to Ramadi and were augmenting that. And then 1 company and all of the support equipment, because the MEU has helicopters and logistics and trucks and scout snipers and a bunch of other and more LAVs. The rest of the equipment, so the 2 infantry companies were sent here, and the rest were sent to augment the western area here. And that's important because at the time, the LAR battalion had basically a huge area. They had basically everything. This whole western desert portion of Iraq, what fell to maybe about 700 Marines, this whole western area. Now, most of this is desert and unpopulated, but also there's a lot of traffic coming in and out of these highways that they were supposed to be monitoring. And they couldn't really do it with what they had. And then they also had been, this village here called Rutba, for the time prior, had been essentially walled off. You can sort of see the scars of it here. They had, someone in the past, in a previous, somewhere between 2003 and 2006, had built a dirt wall all the way around the city. This whole berm, you can kind of follow, there's a berm that was cut all the way around the city. And no one was allowed to come in or out except by this road here. Only some maybe military traffic we allowed here in this road, but every other, and then there was a checkpoint basically at each of these other roads coming in with a few, like a platoon of LAR, so like 4 light armored vehicles, kind of with a little dirt berm around them, and like a little headquarters area built. So each of these entry points had been, no traffic was supposed to come in or out, nothing was supposed to go into the city through the desert, and there were fobs built here. There was like the LAR kind of set up a headquarters here and here, and nothing was allowed to come in, or only civilians were only allowed to come in or out after being thoroughly searched, having their vehicle completely searched, and coming in or out. What's worth noting about that too is the water supply to the city came from some wells just to the west or east, right about here. So there was no fresh water supply except through a pipeline that came into the city from here, which they damaged in construction of the fob. They punctured the pipeline with a earth mover, and so no fresh water was able to come in except by truck. So there would be several truckloads every day coming in, filling up at this well, and then being searched and coming into the city to distribute water to the people in the city.
That's insane. That's insane. How many people live in that city? Like, would you say 20,000?
Let's. I don't. I wish I should have had.
I'm just trying to base it off of like,
They have it at 28,000 ish. Yeah.
So there's no freshwater supply in the entire village for 28,000 people.
Yep. Because the water main there was a water pipeline that was busted right around here when they were constructing this base, and no one is allowed to come in or out. Well, more or less, what you would have is this. You can't really see elevation here, but this is kind of below. It's kind of in not a valley exactly, but the ground was higher in both directions, and right around here is where they would have to park their vehicles and wait their turn to leave the city. And likewise in the other direction, they'd park and wait for more than a day. Sometimes they'd be waiting for their turn to go through the checkpoint. And when they went into the checkpoint, we would interview them as civil affairs, and they would have to submit to having their fingerprints and iris scanned, and they would have to have an ID created if they didn't have one. And effectively, this, they had said this is where I'm not sure whether it was lost in translation or not, but the LAR battalion sort of had said they don't have enough manpower to really go in through the city lest something go wrong, because they're responsible for this entire huge area, and they only have about maybe 16 of these vehicles total in a battalion. There's four for a platoon. Maybe more than that. Maybe there's 4 for each platoon, 3 platoons and companies. That's 12, and so about 36. About 36 vehicles and crews for this whole entire region that they're supposed to be working in. And there's already more or less a platoon worth 4 at each of the entry points to the city. And so they didn't really have enough manpower to control the situation if something did go wrong. And what was happening was pretty regularly somebody would come up somewhere along this this ridge here, and take a shot at the search line. I wasn't there when it happened, but a Marine got shot in the neck there at the search line, and I got shot at once. It went high over my head, but they were once a week or so, somebody would come up here and somewhere along this hill line take a reasonably well-aimed shot at the Marines that were exposed where the vehicles were being searched on the road. And sometimes the response to this was, and you have to keep in mind, there's dozens of cars parked up here at any time. Sometimes the response was for the LAV, usually with its 50 cal. They had, or there was a small little, it's called an observation post, a little headquarters area with a radio and a little 50 cal mounted on the roof. They would open up on where they thought the shot came from, and if that happened to be among a dozen or so cars with civilians waiting for their chance to get in out of the city, so be it. So that, definitely, if it resulted in any civilians being killed, I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine it not happening. What it definitely resulted in was cars being shot up and scaring the living Jesus out of the people. I remember clearly seeing them like falling over backwards trying to get away after somebody shot at a Marine, and then the Marines responded in kind. And that just didn't bode well for like the relationship to the people of the city, being cut off from the world, effectively having to wait for a day or more to get in or out of their own town, having their water supply disrupted, and having to buy water that's being trucked in. And they decided that the solution to this was with that extra company of Marines from the MU and all the additional support that they had to. And I think really honestly, a MU comes with a colonel in charge. And they're only there for a limited time, a few months, not a full deployment, but instead 2 to 4 months usually. And I think they wanted to make a mark. They wanted an opportunity to do a major operation that they can coordinate and really say that they cleared a city of insurgents while they were there, to take stake that claim, rather than just say we showed up and we helped run checkpoint operations for a while, So they came up with a scheme to clear every house, to search every house in the entire city and flush out the insurgency that existed there. such as it was. And so this was going to happen in about February. I was the only one on my civil affairs team that had any experience prior. And I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder, if I'm being honest. I probably didn't communicate some things as well as I was, or maturely as I could have. But my team leader was a captain who came from the air wing side, and he was very aloof and very eager to please the MEU commander, because the MEU commander also, it's when you get to what's called a MEF, any of the expeditionary forces, so a Marine Expeditionary Force or a Marine Expeditionary Unit, a MEU, it's not just an infantry battalion and the ground combat element. The commander of that is in charge of the logistical and the air wing element as well. So they have their strength. It's not just the infantry themselves. It is also the infantry plus a logistical support element and an air wing element of helicopters and ground crew and maintenance and all that. So for this air wing captain, this is an opportunity to impress a MEU commander, a person that's, you know what I mean, and work with those other aspects. He was pretty incompetent on the ground side. So when they decided to do this operation, he just didn't object to any things that seemed obviously stupid to me. Like, among the plans we were going to clear every house, and the Marines would sleep every night. Actually, we were clearing by night. We were going to clear by night, kick indoors at night, and then by day we were going to sleep in a house that seemed suitable. And the plan was for the Marines to use their own, to just confiscate the bedding in the house and sleep in whatever, to kick the family out, and then sleep in their beds, or use their sheets and blankets and whatnot, And because there was a whole discussion, well, we can't have them searching and carrying backpacks around. It's going to be too cumbersome, And I kind of objected that, not only is this kind of somewhat inhumane to take people's warm bedding in the middle of winter, but it's also kind of, I tried to make a public, do you really, there was a bit of dehumanizing of Iraqis, and do you really want to sleep in their filthy beds? You know what I mean? It's like,
of course, yeah. Well, not only that,
I was trying to persuade them by that. I knew they thought that their bedding would be filthy and not worth sleeping in.
Well, I see what you mean. You were making the argument yeah, why would you want to sleep in their filthy beds?
Yeah, to try to dissuade them from using this as a plan. They went forward with that anyways. But it just, nothing was being said for the civilian side. Nothing civil affairs wise was being done to alleviate or kind of deal with the issues in the way that we should deal with them. We should be dealing with this problem with the water and getting it fixed, but nobody seems to care. You know what I mean?
Right.
And the other thing that's worth noting, well, actually, I'll hold on to that for a second. But so eventually they decided they're going to go ahead with this operation. And it happens, I don't know if there's timestamps on the pictures, because I took a few pictures during that time. So maybe there's timestamps. Actually, hold on. No, I want to share my full screen. Stop sharing. There we go. So I had this image. Are we on the images?
Yep.
Yeah. So if there's a timestamp on here, then maybe I can see. No, I don't have it. I don't know. Let's see, info. No, it's not worth it. I can't remember exactly when we did this, but it was sometime in I want to say around January, February timeframe.
Okay.
And
would it be under properties? Well, that's okay. We can leave it.
Yeah, it's not
file info at the bottom.
File info. Let's see. No, it definitely wasn't June 23rd. This is when I copied the image from my other computer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's in either case, and they decided that it was a good idea to search every house, and they went about that in a relatively military manner. The first day of the operation, or actually we did a preliminary into like just into the edge of the village, and within like 2 streets our commander got lost and froze. Like we had literally just like driven 2 blocks into the city, and he lost track of the rest of the unit as they were moving, and shoot. And then he froze, and I was like, "Sir, we either have to go back or move. We can't just sit here as a truck by ourselves in the middle of the city. You know, if something bad happened, like." And he was an idiot. Like, he just was not a ground commander, and he didn't understand that we couldn't just sit there and wait until somebody came to find us. And we weren't that far into the city in the first place that we could, we could just go back. And I was like, "Sir, if nothing else, we go back. We don't just sit here, you know." Because they had elevated buildings all around us, and we can't really, if there were a problem. So that was just before we did the operation. The operation went relatively smoothly. On the first night, we cleared a bunch of houses. One of the units, a friend of mine, like, they broke up our civil affairs team that was there to one of us with each platoon as we were going through. And my one buddy, the platoon he was with, a kid got shot on the roof of the house, and I'm hesitant to say, I think he dramatized things a little bit, but
Wait,
all right, go ahead.
You said that a kid got shot. Was this an American?
A Marine. Yeah, a Marine. I'm sorry. A Marine got shot while he was standing on the roof of the house that they were occupying. And then the Marines, according to my friend, responded by pretty much shooting everyone in the immediate vicinity for the next day or so, until they moved on the following night. I'm not fully inclined to take him at his word on that they really were as draconian as shooting. He sort of implied that they shot women that were coming to pick up bodies. I don't necessarily believe that, because I think he might have been exaggerating, but there was a good amount of shooting that happened. We could hear it. It was only a few blocks away, So this is an image of Korean Village, by the way. And then this is an image of Rutba from where we finally stopped. One of the things I noticed during this, and I believe we've talked about this before, is, it became pretty clear the types of houses we would choose to occupy were the richest houses in the neighborhood. And when we occupy a house, we don't just sleep there for the night or for the day. We knock out all the windows, punch holes in the walls, sandbag where the windows were, lock the family in their bathroom for the night, keep them under gun and guard, eat their food, steal their bedding, and generally leave the place a wreck, And the Marines took, and I think we've talked about this before too, the Marines took my presence there as the civil affairs guy as sort of a green light to damage as much as they could, because it gave them moral license, because they knew that civil affairs would pay a claim on it and maybe would reimburse these people for the damage. But that obviously, if they did get reimbursed, it had to be signed off by my team leader, and they would have had to come to us for the claim. And I don't think we paid all the claims for all the damages we did, but they stole food from a shopkeeper who had a little storehouse and things along those lines. But the point is, that's one of the first times when I started to make connections between the American insurgency, let's say, and the Quartering Act, and how onerous it is to be subjected to having Marines, a foreign occupying force, quarter themselves in your home. And how we really were pretty persistently doing all the things that I believed as sort of a constitutional patriot, oriented towards the patriots of the revolution person, that I was sympathizing with the insurgents, you know what I mean? In the sense of, like, if this was happening to my town, I might be inclined to take a pot shot at the people that are not letting me, it was ridiculous, honestly, that people couldn't come and go from where they lived as they pleased, and that Marines didn't see a problem with it at all. if any, this is what we have to do. There's bad guys, and we have to catch them. We have to find them and catch them. They're smuggling things. They never found anything that I know of at that checkpoint. Marines got killed maintaining that check, or injured, shot in the neck, maintaining that checkpoint. And when we ended up searching every house in the village, on the third night or so, that a sniper team shot a guy that was running down the road with an AR-15. And from that time to the end of deployment, there wasn't a single other incident. There wasn't a single other incident of combat in that village. So what we had was effectively one guy with an AR-15 that, kept the entire Marine Corps, or at least an LAR battalion, at bay. You know what I mean? Out of the city. Now, granted, there were these onerous restrictions on life there, but this one guy running around with an AR-15 was able to keep an entire infantry battalion from really occupying the city, or the occupation from working, because we weren't in the governance center. We weren't controlling what was happening there. We just had put a fence around the city effectively and called it a no-go area, because one guy with an AR-15 was taking pot shots at us once a week.
That's an insurgency, right?
Yeah. And it took an entire MEU and a several days long search operation, kicking in every house in the door of every house in the middle of the night to find that, and bring that to an end, at least temporarily. And I suspect in the process we made things a whole lot worse. So that was like the major event of that deployment. After that, for a few months, we were going around, we were paying battle damage claims somewhat regularly. This is where I think I've told you about an incident. If I haven't, I've talked about it so many times, where the policy at the time was to, if a vehicle didn't seem to be stopping, to, you shout, show, shove, and shoot. You would fire a flare, and then at this time, normally on my previous deployment, the policy was there was no such thing as a warning shot. You know what I mean? You only shoot to kill. On this deployment, they had taken to firing a tracer on the ground in front of the car as a warning. Well, in at least this case, the tracer skipped off the ground in front of the car and hit the driver of the car behind him. So somebody who was not doing anything wrong. And he came into our little, what we called a CMOC, a Civil Military Operations Center. We had set up shop in a school after the operation was all over. And we were paying out claims to people for damages. And he comes in, with a bandage around his jaw, and he can't really talk. And this is just emblematic of how just asinine my team leader was, because he was very reluctant to pay out claims. He was very tight-wadded with the government's money for some reason. And this guy shows up just saying that he wants with help, but literally his jaw is practically detached. It's hanging by like some sinew on one side, and he's holding it while he's trying to explain what happened. And just not an ounce of sympathy from my team leader. And effectively he was like, well, you can't prove that a Marine did that to you. You know what I mean? Like, what does he want? And he's basically saying, I need money so I can go to the hospital. You know what I mean? I need cash to go to the hospital with. And he's like, well, and it was just absurd. And then what was funny about it, and this kind of, when we mentioned the hospital, we were also supposed to go around, and supposedly at some point in the past, all of our records up to this time were kept on paper. If we did a project, if we made a claim, it was effectively how good at organizing you were, and whether you kept a file folder with the name of the project and like the number it was given, which was like the date and time that it was signed off on or something like that. And you kept the sheets that when the payments had been made and maybe the location. Well, when you're doing that on paper and you have turnover every 6 months, a new unit, stuff gets lost or discarded. And we were asked or told that there had been something like $1 million spent on a hospital in Rutba in the past. And we were supposed to go check out and see how, now that we had access to the city again, we were supposed to go see how well that money had been spent. We couldn't find any record of this, and we couldn't find anyone who could tell us we went to the hospital and no one there remembered anyone ever giving them money for anything. And then eventually we found like effectively we went around looking and we found a like clinic that was basically barren, but had like been created as a hospital for the city and somebody absconded with the money and whatever equipment was supposed to have been purchased. But like what it pointed out was like, I knew that there had been somebody from our unit who was there a year before who did this project, but they weren't sent back to the same city again. They could have easily gone back and said, oh, that's where the hospital was. That's what we did. This is the guy who did it. Or, oh, that liar, that thief, you know what I mean? They at least there could have been some kind of recollection. We're just literally bumping around looking for anything that looks like a hospital and asking, hey, did the Marines pay to build this? Because there's no institutional memory when you're sending different people back to the same place over and over again. And the same thing happened in Fallujah and all over the country when you're not sending the same unit back to the territory they were in before, you're not developing any institutional memory or an ability to really carry out things effectively, so that sort of tried to get rectified with a program called Sydney that came into effect in Afghanistan that maybe we'll talk about next time. But there was just no real, like, keeping paper records of these things is where all that money just flew out the window, or seems to have flown out the window and been for nothing. So that's, as far as I can recall, the most interesting things about my second time in Iraq. I got home in March of 2007, and I pretty much at that point was really jaded on the Marine Corps. I felt like it was a completely flawed institution, that really the only thing that was good in it was like one captain I happened to have in command once, and that everyone else in the Marine Corps was more or less a moron who couldn't, make simple, like obvious, simple, correct decisions, is the feeling. I came off really, really just jaded and disappointed in the Marine Corps and just wanted to get out and be done with it at that time, was the feeling I had, because it was just nothing's getting better and we're not going to do this. We're never going to do this the right way. Part of me did want to save the Marine Corps and thought about becoming an officer and trying to set it straight. Like, maybe a good officer can make a difference. I had a team leader who made one deployment good, even though everyone else had a bad. The first deployment to Iraq, every other team had a bad time. I don't know many. We had a uniquely good group of people who became friends and a uniquely good officer in charge of our team. Everyone else in our unit did not have a good deployment, or what I would call, even though bad things happened and all that. My first deployment I called a good deployment because we had a good leader. And so I did have this feeling of, well, maybe I could be that person. Maybe I should, somewhere in the back of my mind. But really, ultimately, the entire institution of the Marine Corps was like obviously corrupt and flawed to me at that point.
One thing I wanted to talk about, and we're a little pressed for time here, but one thing I wanted to talk about was, I don't know if people have a conception of how big a 50 cal round is. I have a live one here in my reloading bench is in the other room, but it's like this big.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, it's probably about a little bit longer than a pen, and the diameter is about, a little shy, maybe about a nickel.
Yeah.
About the diameter of a nickel.
So
it'll punch a good hole in something.
This is so talking a little bit about, and this kind of bleeds into the Afghanistan deployment, but the Dishka rounds. Mm-hmm. Did they say that a Dishka round fired, if you get within like a meter of someone, it will melt their skin or something like? Is that a myth?
So that actually kind of relates to my so I think that's a myth. Okay. I heard myths about 50 cal rounds, and that a 50 cal round, even if it doesn't hit you, will just, if it comes within X many inches of you, will blow your knee off. You know what I mean? Like, the shock wave is enough. I don't know. I don't know enough about that but I think that's all just urban legend. Because what I thought when I first got shot, or the ricochet hit my leg on my first deployment, was I thought that a bullet had come close but not hit me. because the feeling that I'd gotten was like I'd been punched, or like a little feeling of compression. You know what I mean? And my initial thought was that was just a really close round going past my leg, and I felt sort of a punch from the shock wave. So I don't know if there's some, and as it turned out, that wasn't the case, because it was actually just some fragments that ricocheted and hit me in the leg, you know? So yeah, I don't really know about the exact term of ballistic effects, but what I do know, just looking like that, it'll ruin your car. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
going to do a lot of damage to those people's cars. Oh, that reminds me of one other thing, sort of about one incident where we were at this checkpoint. We spent a lot of time just sitting around at this checkpoint, bullshitting and playing spades at night. And at one point, they were improving the checkpoint. They sent some engineers out. The MU came, and they have engineering assets and other assets that Infantryman doesn't have. So the MU logistical people came in and were putting in showers for us. And they had these water guys there that we just made friends with. I don't know, just charisma, whatever. They were hanging out. They were living there for a week or so while they were building shower facilities for us and improving this little checkpoint. And they were very, very. One thing that happens across the Marine Corps is, you've heard of the combat action ribbon, right? Or are you aware of this? So the Army has an equivalent they call they actually added this. They had a combat infantryman's badge, okay, and that was for an infantryman who served X amount of time in combat, okay. And then eventually the Army came up with what they called a something equivalent, but it was basically for if you weren't, but combat infantryman's badge. So one you might see on a general or whatever, where it has a rifle on a field of blue. It's kind of long and rectangular, and then it has a wreath around it. Is the combat infantryman's badge. That would be the sign of an infantry soldier. You know what I mean? And then later you might see one that has like a knife and a wreath around it, and that would be, the Army kind of had to create this because there were a lot of logistical people or non-infantry people that were seeing combat in Iraq, and they wanted some recognition on their chests too. The Marine Corps has always had what they call a combat action ribbon. It's a ribbon. It's only worn in your dress uniform. It doesn't come with a corresponding medal, but it signifies, no matter what your job was in the Marine Corps, if you were shot at and returned fire, you get. And then they eventually changed it to took appropriate action. Like, what if you got mortared but you didn't respond? Or what if you got mortared and panicked, you wouldn't be eligible, but if you got mortared and took appropriate action, you would earn a combat action ribbon. But at the time, the standard was you had to fire. In 2004 through 2007, and typically a combat action ribbon shows that you were shot at and returned fire. So that, and it really is widely regarded as something that's the combat infantryman's badge.
So this is the combat action ribbon.
Yeah, for Marines, yeah.
Okay. What was the other one called? Sorry.
I know they call it a CAB, a combat action badge. Maybe that's the Army one.
See, yeah.
Yeah. I know they just refer to it as a cab. We'll call ours a car. A lot of times. And Marines desperately want that. It's one of the real signs that you are legitimate, that you really did go overseas and see some shit. It's an outward sign that you were shot at and shot back, and you were actually in combat, not just deployed to Afghanistan or to Iraq, right? So Marines want this, and they want it pretty bad. Probably more than any other ribbon Marines want. It's this one. You know what I mean? It makes you a real boy. Everyone will look at you and believe that you have some legitimacy automatically. But the incentive it creates is that if there's a shot, for you to fire, regardless of whether you see anything, regardless of whether you have any reason to. So, I mean, I have to be honest. When I was my first firefight, I did have to shoot, but I was sometimes shooting it just where the tanks were, just so that people knew that I shot. You know what I mean? I wasn't exactly thinking about getting a car. I kind of knew the minute we were there, I'm getting a car for this. But it goes through Marines' minds. So when we were there at this base, and there were some combat engineers there, they didn't have scopes in the rifle, and that distance between that where those cars were parked and whatnot was a few hundred yards. You couldn't really see. You can't really see a person at that distance, like, or you can just barely unmagnified. You know what I mean? But they all go running out the minute they hear a shot coming in and the 50 cal open up and start all firing. And at the time, our unit had gotten ACOGs, so I had a scope, and also they were willing to listen to me. And I was the one screaming at them to get back behind the wall and cease fire, because there's nothing they're going to do that's going to help the situation. But they wanted to desperately, so that they could go back to their command and say, "Oh, we shot our weapon." You know what I mean? We got a car. So they wanted their cars too. I guarantee you that was part of their motivation to go running out and start shooting, was their car. And it kind of came up because I talked to Scott Ritter. Is a pretty big name. He was one of the whistleblowers who tried to speak out against invading Iraq over WMDs. He was an inspector for the OPCW. He and I had a little back and forth on Twitter over the event in Afghanistan, where where ISIS-K supposedly blew up outside of Kabul airport.
Yeah.
And then there's, it's been kind of dropped, but there's a lot of belief that a lot of the people that were killed by Marines or other people providing security at Kabul shooting wildly. And I said, basically in response to something he had said, Marines will fire for the sake of firing. These Marines are not ones that have been in Afghanistan for months. They were sent there in an emergency situation, and this is the last time anyone's going to be in Afghanistan. The other thing about cars too is you can only get one per country. So if you go on multiple deployments to Afghanistan and you shoot every time, you get one car. If you go to Afghanistan and Iraq, you shoot in both countries, you get a car and a star for your car. You know what I mean? And then if you have combat in several other countries, you could have several stars on your car. I guarantee you, on some level, in some of those people's minds, they wanted an opportunity to fire their rifle to get a car in Afghanistan, and this was going to be the last chance to get it for Afghanistan. I guarantee. And he said he's of the belief that the Marines would never do something like that, and they have more discipline than that. And I'm here to tell you it's not true. That there are plenty of Marines who would want desperately to fire around if they had an excuse to, at least one, to be able to get a car.
And I know that our buddy Will Porter, our mutual friend, he had a really good Twitter thread kind of trying to deconstruct and figure out what the evidence is that it was Marines doing the shooting.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what killed a lot of those civilians.
Yeah. And I can just tell you firsthand, that's one of the times where I saw it, that these engineers were just running out and shooting because they knew it was a chance to get a car.
Yeah. Well, this is incredible, Scott. I mean, I'm so glad that we've been able to do this, because I guess selfishly for myself, I find it super interesting, but I'm sure that for the sake of history, I mean, could you imagine if we could take a World War II vet or a Vietnam vet and have him walk through everything on Google Maps and show the fortifications, or at least the skeletons of them that existed? So this is really a unique experience, I think, for me at least. But,
well, I've been wanting to do something like this, like an oral history of everything, for a long time. You know what I mean? So this is a great opportunity. I know Prof. CJ did one with a fella a while back, and I kind of had reached out to him, like, hey, if you're ever looking for some content, but you got the jump on CJ.
I did. Yeah, I did. Well, actually, that was kind of what inspired me to do this with you, is because I listened to that.
Yeah.
That you've done. So, okay, well, we had a couple month gap between your first deployment and this one. Maybe we'll shoot for another month or something like that, just to get some content in between. But you got a lot of personal stuff coming up, so we'll give it a bunch of time, and then we'll come back maybe December or something.
Yeah, well, that might, we're talking about maybe having a little staycation or something in December to kind of take a break from that stuff. So maybe that'd be a good opportunity.
Cool. Yeah. So I got to do some plugs before we go. Just that, so I don't have to do any editing.
Get it in.
Yeah, so you know how you can help support the Liberty Weekly podcast? That's by going to libertyweekly.net/support. There you can find all the links. You can find Patreon, Subscribestar, PayPal. I got to fix the button, but all the cryptocurrency addresses and all that. You can do all those things. You can go to rockfin.com, ROKFIN.com. And if you pay $10 per month, you get access to not just my bonus content, but you also get it for a whole bunch of other, like everyone else on the site, all their bonus content there. So it's a great deal. Or you can go to odyssey.com, ODYSEE, and you can help support my content with LBC, the cryptocurrency. Also, the Liberty Weekly podcast is part of the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org, where you can find the fine podcasts and a bunch of great articles from our awesome writers. But you can find all of these shows here. Year Zero with Tommy Salmons, Keith Knight's Don't Tread on Anyone, Kyle Anzalone, Conflicts of Interest, Free Man Beyond the Walls, and Scott Horton. So Pete Quinones there with Free Man Beyond the Wall. So thank you so much, Scott. You know, it's great to see you, and I'm so glad that we got a chance to meet each other in person, and hopefully it won't be a long time before we get to do that again.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks a lot, man.
All right.
Have a good one.